Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about nature. Something that you will hear a lot, depending on which communities and sub-communities you belong to, is the idea that paganism, broadly speaking, or particular pagan traditions, constitute a nature religion. Paganism is a nature religion. We worship nature. That's a thing you'll hear a lot. And I think that language is really fraught in a way that the people who use it don't ever intend for it to be. But I think that nature as such is a really nebulous concept. And that the thing that people generally mean when they talk about nature doesn't actually exist. So, I mean, when we talk about nature, right? When I say paganism is a nature religion, pagans worship nature, you have a pretty good intuitive sense of what I mean. Forests are nature. Cities are not nature. Flowers are nature. Television is not nature. Horses are nature. Cars are not nature. You know, crystals are nature. And steel is not nature. There's this sort of intuitive divide that I think a lot of us have almost unquestioningly between the things that we consider natural and the things that we consider not natural. Artificial might be a good word for sort of the distinction. But when you drill down on that distinction falls apart pretty quickly, and the fact that we have it in place can lead to problems. If we think about what is natural in the very broadest sense, I'm going to be a pedant here, I'm sorry, it's relevant, I promise. Anything that exists is natural, is in accordance with the laws of nature. If something were unnatural, it could not exist, because nature wouldn't allow it. So nature includes not just the things that we're used to thinking of as natural, right? Flowers and forests and horses, but also all of the things that we typically think of as not natural. Steel is natural. Steel has a chemical structure that holds together according to the laws of nature. Plastic is natural because plastic has a chemical structure that holds together according to the laws of nature. If it were unnatural, it couldn't exist. Planes are natural. They fly up in the sky because of the Bernoulli principle, which is a law of nature. I don't know if it officially counts as a law, but regardless, it is a principle about fluid dynamics that has to do with the laws of nature. So all of the things that exist in our world, including the things that we tend to think of as artificial, are, in the most fundamental sense, natural. And when people talk about things being natural in this sort of more romanticized sense, I think the idea that a lot of us have in our minds is that natural things are things that are untouched by people, right? Natural things are the things that exist independently of humans, that are sort of unmarred by human interference, and therefore have a kind of idyllic beauty to them before, like, big bad humanity swoops in and ruins it all with pollution and industrialization and these other terrible things. And again, it's a very intuitive concept in many ways. I know the things that we talk about when we say something is natural or isn't natural. But that definition, that idea that natural means, like, independent, free of the interference of humans, that doesn't work. For one thing, fossil fuels would count as natural, according to that definition. And when pagans say that they worship nature, I think generally speaking, most of us don't have petroleum in mind. But fossil fuels are made according to a process whereby plant matter gets compressed and decomposes in a way that leads to the creation of these chemical compounds that then can be burned in a way that combusts and releases energy. Like, that's all very natural. And that's a thing that happens independently of any human interference. And then conversely, broccoli is not natural, according to that definition, because the broccoli plant only exists because of generations upon generations of successive selective planting by humans that brought out certain characteristics in the plant and caused it to evolve the way that it did. Broccoli, as such, did not exist prior to humans and only exists because we modified that plant across several generations in order to make it more edible and more appealing. But if we're working with sort of an implicit definition of natural that includes fossil fuels and excludes broccoli, we're not hitting the mark. And I think, really and truly, I think that what a lot of us mean when we talk about nature, particularly in the context of the idea of a nature religion, is this romantic rejection of modernity, and in particular a rejection of industrialization. I think that when a lot of people talk about things being natural, what they mean is not obtained using industrial means, something that doesn't come out of a factory, right? So handcrafted whatever furniture, as opposed to something mass-produced by IKEA. And, you know, tinctures derived from herbs as opposed to something synthesized in mass and compressed into tablets and sold in the pharmacy. I think that's the distinction that people really have in mind, is it industrial, or can I imagine a way in which it would be accessible without or prior to the invention of the modern factory and the development of industrialization, you know, circa mid-19th century. I think that's really what a lot of people are expressing when they talk about nature in the context of paganism. And it's a romantic idea, romantic with a capital R, romantic meaning the romantic movement in art and literature and so on that explicitly rejected industrialization and sort of the perceived evils of industrialization in favor of an idyllic view of country life, agrarian life, connection with the wild, untamed spaces, and so on. And the Romantic movement in art and literature was a pretty significant influence on the development of the pagan revival, right? This was a thing that inspired a lot of people in Wicca and elsewhere who were looking for a way of connecting to religion that felt old, that felt like it gave them something they were missing from their largely urban or suburban post-industrial lives. And they imagined a pre-industrial utopia where, you know, everyone was living in harmony with the trees and the animals and the sun and the rain and all of that. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, right? I love trees and animals and the sun and the rain. Like, those are all great things. Those are all things that I consider worthy of my veneration. But I think that when we use the language of nature, when we use the language of natural, and particularly when we do that in the context of religion, we have to be really careful about just thinking about what we're saying, because that language carries a value judgment with it. As soon as you say, you know, paganism is a nature religion, we worship nature, and what counts as nature is what I imagine pre-industrial life to have been like. That's telling me what you think is worth worshiping and what you think is bad and not worth worshiping. And it carries some really heavy assumptions with it. For one thing, it carries with it sort of a rejection of a lot of modernity. And don't get me wrong, there are things about modernity that maybe we should question and interrogate, right? Like, industrialization tends to go hand in hand with capitalism, and particularly nowadays it goes in hand with, like, global capitalism, the existence of sweatshops and labor exploitation, and sort of the way that we outsource labor overseas in a way that basically turns into slavery. Like, they're really serious things that we should question and think about and sit with. And yeah, maybe part of the work that we do in our religion should involve untangling that and trying to find a way to connect to life that doesn't depend on this sort of gross capitalist consumerist machinery that is constantly producing new things and demanding that people buy new things in a way that is deeply unsustainable and in a way that relies on massive exploitation, often of sort of people in poorer countries, right? Like that's a thing we should think about and talk about. But when we gloss over all of that with just sort of this like natural versus unnatural thing, I think we lose a lot of that nuance. I think we lose sight of some of the more important central elements of that conversation. And importantly, it becomes not just sort of a critical interrogation of like the horrors of global capitalism. It becomes a rejection of everything modern, a rejection of everything, you know, that industrialism has brought us. And there are some really good, important things in modernity that we didn't have prior to the Industrial Revolution, right? When we reject modernity and industrialization wholesale under the guise of trying to embrace what's natural, we risk rejecting scientific advancements and particularly like medical advancements. We risk rejecting the development of new technologies that can help sort of equalize inequalities. We risk rejecting social advances, things like, you know, expanded rights for women or LGBT minorities. Like, these are all things that have come with modernity. And if we try to reject modernity too quickly, because we're reaching for this idealized vision of nature and what's natural, that leads down a pretty dark road pretty quickly. So if you think about some of the ways that the language of nature and what's natural can be weaponized, and do get weaponized, you get anti-vaxxers who want to reject vaccination, and then who are opposed to like medicine more broadly, like Western, you know, medicine that they'll call it. Like, you get people who will say, no, we need natural healing, and therefore we're not going to take vaccines. We're not going to use antibiotics, right? Like, no penicillin for us. We want our bodies to heal naturally. That's really bad. A lot of people die that way. But the language of natural, which is a sort of thinly concealed language of anti-industrialism and anti-modernity. When we focus too much on uplifting what we consider natural, and it's framed in those terms, it very quickly leads to that kind of rejection of modern medicine and modern science, which is why you get so many people in, you know, alternative spiritualities, hippies and pagans and so on, who very quickly go down that road of anti-vax, because that language of what's natural being like the thing that's right and that we should uplift has so much baggage with it. Similarly, romanticized ideals of what's natural often get looped in with very conservative like gender roles. There's this natural idea of like the man as the father and the protector and the breadwinner and the woman as the one who stays home and produces children and raises them and does the housework. And there's this idea that because that kind of highly gendered family structure was associated with pre-industrial life, regardless of the extent to which it actually was, certainly like in the popular imagination, that's what people think. We get this idea that comes out that that kind of family structure is natural and is therefore better. And if we are rejecting the artificial world, if we're rejecting the modern post-industrial society we live in, well, what does that mean? We have to return to the golden age when men were men and women were women and women raised the children and men were manly and did manly jobs. And that was a bad time. That was a bad time where a lot of women were trapped and helpless and had no access to or control over their own finances, were not protected from domestic violence. And I mean, like, there continue to be really serious issues regarding like gender disparity in the world that we live in today. But the idea that we should regress back to something more natural as a rejection of modernity carries with it these really, really dangerous undertones of trying to reinstitute social structures that did a lot of harm to a lot of people. Same thing, right? Like, when we start talking about what's natural being worthy of worship or being the core of paganism, then you get ideas like, well, you know, heterosexual reproductive sex is natural, and other ways of having sex are not natural, and therefore heterosexual reproductive sex is the good thing and is what we should be like uplifting with our religion and promoting, and other forms of sex are not natural and should not be condoned or embraced or allowed by our religion. And there are people in pagan communities who say exactly that. And all of this, again, like, I'm still a fan of the forests and the flowers and the sun and the rain, and, you know, I don't particularly like horses, but that's just beef between me and horses. Like, I'm still a fan of these things that we collectively tend to associate with nature. I still like these things. These things still figure pretty significantly in a lot of elements of my religious practice. I have, like, one of the representations of the goddess that I use most often on my altar is a fucking seashell, right? Which is a very, like, romanticized, the goddess is connected to the sea and the, you know, tides. And, like, I still engage in a lot of this. I just think it's important to be really careful about when we use this idea of nature and what's natural, especially if it's framed implicitly, as it often is, in opposition to modernity and industrialism, because there's a lot of hidden baggage that comes with that, that most of us don't think about when we use words like nature or natural, but that is kind of lurking there, waiting to be exploited. And there are people who do exploit it in really dangerous and harmful ways. So I just, like, I'm suspicious of saying that paganism is a nature religion. I think that leads down a troublesome road. I think there are other ways of framing similar ideas, right? I think that for certain people, paganism is an ecologically oriented religion, right? It has to do with the relationship that we have to the ecosystems that we inhabit. I think that there are ways of saying that paganism is a life-celebrating religion. But those things carry kind of similar meanings, but they're not defined in opposition to modernity and industrialism in the way that I think our concept of nature often really implicitly is. And that's just the thing that I'm always really careful of. So that's about all I have for today, so I'm gonna go feed my sourdough starter, but thanks for listening, and I will catch you sometime soon. Bye.